Hello YouTube. I've been thinking recently about why there's often a disparity between what your average game player wants out of a game and what your average reviewer looks at. Now, there is certainly an element of the people reviewing them just being ideologically driven retards that just want to go on about how they're the only ones who understand what being a good person is, and everybody else is a Nazi or a cuckold or whatever the fuck they want. There is certainly some of that, but there is a lot more to it than that. There are a lot of different factors, but I think it comes down to two main issues. The first one is actually a quirk of human psychology, the way the brain works. For those who don't know, which most people probably do, children have this thing about watching the same film or the same TV show over and over and over when they're very young. In my older daughter's case, it was Shrek. She loved Shrek, and we'd have them pretty much on a constant loop every single day. The reason for that is that the way they remember things doesn't quite work the same way that an adult does. As a child, they don't remember things as well. So they keep re-experiencing it to refresh those memories and to form a larger picture. Basically, repetition. The same way with learning things. You repeat it, it sticks more. There's also a degree of familiarity with it. It's comforting because you're used to it. You know it's not going to change. It gives you that centralized sensation of everything being okay. That latter part continues into adulthood, which is why you'll hear people that say that they have a favourite film and they watch it on a regular basis. Like those people who say, oh, I'll go and watch, for example, I watch Blade Runner pretty much every single year. I watch a different version of it each time because I got that special collector's set that has like 5 different versions of it. So I watch a different cut each time just to mix it up a little bit. But I do that as well. And most people do. And I think when that comes to video games, a lot of people want a game that they can play over and over. So that's why open world games are so popular, because they're so large. You can spend so much time in them and still have a sense of it being different enough to keep your attention. But you see, I don't do that. I will play some games multiple times, but for the most part I'm more looking at experiencing something new. And I think that's because, like other people who review video games, I play a lot of them because I'm more interested in video games as an art form rather than individual games. That's what attracted me to the idea of being a reviewer, looking at different games, those that I enjoy. But I also like stepping outside of my comfort zone sometimes and playing something that I wouldn't otherwise have experienced, and being a reviewer gives me a perfect opportunity to do that because we get review codes for games that I wouldn't otherwise have paid any attention to. That's how I ended up playing The Crew, and I'm very glad of that because I thoroughly enjoyed my experience with that. It was something interesting. So I think that's a key factor. But another thing, segueing into it, is that I think most people don't play as many games as I do, or as many games as most reviewers do. They will only buy a few a year. Now, there are different layers of gamers. There are the really high-end gamers that will try and play everything. I don't think I'm quite at that stage, but I definitely am interested in experiencing more than just one. You then get what you can sort of call, your typical, your hardcore gamer. They'll play several, but they still won't play that many. They'll get one and they'll stick with it for a while. You then get your rank and file, your average person who plays video games. They'll only get a few a year. So they'll be looking for that one big game that they can sink dozens, even hundreds of hours into. You'll then get your casual gamer, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. I mean just somebody who just plays games casually. They might only get 1 or 2 a year, if that, and play a few of them. And then you'll get what I call the social gamers. Those are the people that don't really play video games very often, but when they come around to your house, they'll play like Mario Party or Wii Sports, that kind of thing. And then you get the soccer mums, that sort of demographic, the ones who play Candy Crush, that kind of thing. Reviewers are typically at the higher end where they're playing lots of different games, so they stop looking at an individual game as being an individual game, and they start looking at how it relates to every other game they've played. When you only play 1 or 2, you might not be familiar with the possibility that there are better games out there. course, that's entirely subjective. It depends entirely on what you want. And Red Dead Redemption 2, which I've mentioned several times now, is a great example of that. Most people get sucked into it. It's a very pretty looking game. It's very big. There's a lot you can do. There's a lot to like. There's a lot there to keep you engaged. There's a massive world for you to sink your teeth into and just lose yourself in for hours. The fact that the controls are a bit clunky, it's like, well, it's the only game I have, so, you know, what's the big deal? They're all little nitpicks. And yes, in fact, every single one of the complaints I have about that game is a nitpick. It's just there are so fucking many of them. And for most people, it doesn't seem to be a problem. They can look past that because of those things that I mentioned. There's also, I think, a third element that's equally important. When you are only getting a few games per year, and those are the only ones you can get, you have this psychological bias to get attached to it. You start looking past the flaws because it's the only one you have. You have to justify it to yourself as being, you know, well, I paid money for this. It's the only one I have available, so I'm going to spend the time to justify it. You don't do this, it's not necessarily consciously, but you spend the time justifying the purchase to yourself, because otherwise you're left admitting that you wasted your money. I think that's quite silly because you can always return it, but whatever. But I think that's the main thing it really comes down to, is just the former point, is that most people don't buy a lot of video games. Even the so-called hardcore gamers, you'll often hear them talk about how they have one or two franchises that they get really attached to. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's entirely up to them. You know, everybody's different. Everybody's entitled to viewing things the way they want to. Reviewing video games is entirely subjective, just as it is with any art form. But then you get people like myself who do play a lot of them. We start to see the flaws. We start to pull back and take a broader view of it. Doesn't necessarily mean we're right, because it does come down to a lot of subjectivity. There is no such thing as an objectively bad game. Not really. There can be things that you could argue are objectively bad about it. You know, if it's buggy and it doesn't work, well, yeah, that's a problem. If the frame rate is terrible to the point of being unplayable, yep, that's a problem. Those are objective facts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't enjoy the game. I mean, look at what's that one? That Big Rigs one, I think it's called? Skate 3. Actually, let's look at Skate 3. The physics in that is completely broken, but that's one of the biggest appeals of the game. It makes it a lot of fun. It makes it very silly, and it makes it easier for you to put a lot of hours into it, just seeing how you can break it. So that's what people do. They look at what they have, and most people look at it as an individual piece, and they weigh up whether they like it or not. And that seems to be the more important feature that people focus on, whether they enjoy it, whether they like it. Whereas when you have to review a game and you have to try and look at everything about it, you start to focus on these problems, you start to pick them out, and you start to weigh and contrast them against other games, other parts of that game. And most people don't do that. They don't need to do that. And I think that's where I've said this a couple of times now, but let me reiterate. I think that's where the big problem comes from. That's why there's such a huge disparity in some cases. That's why you can have a game that or a film or whatever that the audience loves, and the reviewers tear it to shreds. There's not just the ideological aspect, of course, as I previously stated, that does exist as well, but the main thing does come down to just having a fundamentally different approach to it. When you're only playing a few games at a time, you treat each one as its own unique entity. When you're playing lots of different ones, especially lots of different games within the same genre or same style, you start to see commonalities, and you also start to see where things deviate. And sometimes that deviation is good, sometimes not so good, sometimes it was a good idea, poorly implemented, sometimes it was a bad idea, well implemented. And that's why we see so much variation of opinion. And that's a good thing. We need more opinions. We need people to talk about why something doesn't necessarily work. And that doesn't need to fall onto the shoulders of your average Joe Bloggs just playing a video game for a bit of fun. It's perfectly fine for them to enjoy something which you can objectively point to and say, that's broken, that doesn't work. The only problem I have with it is when people start to accept that, you start to see it more often, because if people don't know that they don't need to put the effort in to make things work well, they won't. That is a problem, but that's a discussion for another time. I think I've, in a very rambling, sort of obtuse, round the houses kind of way, made the point I wanted to make. So until next time, I'd just like to say thank you for watching.